Picture this. I'm sitting at my dining table, the home I built from my late husband's life insurance, glowing with memories, my $2 million sanctuary in Troy. Then my parents' voices cut through the warmth like ice. Sell the house to pay off your sister's $900,000 debt, or you're no longer our daughter. My sister Margaret, always the golden child, sits smug, expecting me to save her again. Betrayal burns in my chest, my home, my refuge demanded for her mistakes. I nod, feigning agreement, but inside I'm plotting. I sell the house not to them, but to someone from their past, a man they wronged years ago. When they arrive to claim their prize, the door swings open and their faces drain of color. It's him, and I'm not just the seller. I'm his silent partner, their new creditor. The house they coveted is mine in ways they'll never undo. Their shock is just the beginning. Stay with me for a story packed with jaw-dropping twists, from hidden family secrets to a grandmother's prophetic wisdom. You'll see justice served in ways that'll leave you cheering as I turn their greed into my triumph. Subscribe now to catch every moment of this roller coaster and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a family betrayal like this? Watch to the end for the ultimate payoff that flips everything you thought you knew. My name is Eleanor Hayes, a 52-year-old art history professor living alone in upstate New York, where I've built a quiet life in the Victorian home my late husband Thomas and I once dreamed of together. Widowed 5 years ago after his sudden death, I've found solace in teaching and tending to the house that holds his memory. Each creaky floorboard and sunlit corner feels like a piece of him anchoring me through grief. I should have known the invitation was a trap. My parents, Arthur and Evelyn, rarely asked me to dinner at their modest brick house in Albany, a 40-minute drive from my home in Troy. Their calls usually came with strings requests for advice or worse favors I could never refuse without guilt. But that evening, as I pulled my coat tighter against the October chill and stepped onto their porch, I hoped for a rare moment of family warmth. The smell of roast chicken and rosemary greeted me as I entered, and for a fleeting second, I let myself believe we might just talk about the weather, or my classes at the community college. The dining room was set with the good china, the kind my mother only used for holidays or manipulation. My older sister Margaret was already there, perched at the table with her manicured nails tapping nervously, her blonde hair swept into a tight bun that didn't hide the strain in her eyes. At 55, she still carried the polished air of someone who believed the world owed her a stark contrast to my cardigan and sensible shoes. My father sat at the head, his gray hair thinning but his posture as rigid as ever, while my mother fussed over the gravy, avoiding my gaze. We made small talk through the salad course, how my students loved my lecture on Impressionism, how Dad's garden was surviving the early frost. But the air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Margaret barely touched her food, her fork pushing green beans in circles. I tried to catch her eye, to ask without words what was wrong, but she looked away, her lips pressed thin. My mother cleared the plates with a clatter, and as she set down the chicken carved with precision, my father cleared his throat. That sound, sharp and deliberate, was a signal I'd heard since childhood. It meant business, not sentiment. Eleanor. He began, his voice low but unyielding. We need to talk about your house. My stomach twisted. The house wasn't just my home, it was Thomas's legacy, bought with the life insurance payout after his car accident. Every inch of it, from the rose garden I'd planted to the oak staircase I'd refinished, was a testament to my survival. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. What about it? I asked, keeping my tone, even though my heart was already racing. Margaret shifted in her seat, and my mother shot her a glance quick but loaded with meaning. It's about your sister, Dad continued. She's in trouble. Big trouble. He leaned forward, his hands clasped like a judge about to deliver a verdict. Margaret's debts had caught up with her again, he explained. Nearly $900,000 owed to people who didn't send polite reminders. Loan sharks, an ex-boyfriend with a grudge, a string of bad investments. She'd spun a web so tangled it threatened to choke her. I wanted to ask why I hadn't heard about this sooner, why Margaret hadn't come to me herself, but the answer was in her averted eyes. She'd always been the golden child, the one my parents shielded while I was told to be understanding to sacrifice. "We've thought this through," my mother said, her voice softer but no less firm. "You need to sell the house. It's worth enough to cover what she owes, maybe more. It's the only way to keep her safe." Her words landed like a slap. My house, the one I'd poured my grief into, the one that held Thomas's memory, wasn't mine in their eyes. It was a resource, a lifeline for Margaret's latest disaster. I opened my mouth to protest, but my father cut me off. "This isn't a discussion, Eleanor. It's family. You've always done what's right for us." I looked at Margaret, hoping for some sign of remorse, but she just stared at her plate, her fingers twisting a napkin. "Margaret, you agree with this?" I asked, my voice shaking. She glanced up, her eyes wet but defiant. "I don't have a choice, Ellie," she said, using the nickname she knew I hated. "You're sitting on a fortune. I'm drowning." Her words were a plea wrapped in entitlement, as if my home was a piggy bank she could smash open. I tried to reason with them. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was my sanctuary, my proof I could survive without Thomas. I offered other solutions, a loan, a payment plan, anything but selling. But my mother's face hardened and my father's eyes grew cold. "You've got a good job, Eleanor," he said. "You can start over." Margaret can't. The unfairness burned in my chest. I'd spent my life being the responsible one, the one who didn't ask for rescues while Margaret's messes were swept under everyone else's rug. The room grew quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I pushed my chair back, ready to leave, to escape this betrayal disguised as a family dinner. But my father's voice stopped me cold. "If you don't do this," he said, his gaze locked on mine, unblinking, "then you're no longer our daughter." The words hung in the air, sharp and final, cutting deeper than I thought possible. I looked from him to my mother, hoping for a crack in her resolve, but she just nodded, her lips a tight line. Margaret said nothing, her silence louder than any apology. I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, slamming behind me, my mind racing with a single question. How could they ask me to give up everything? "Then you're no longer our daughter," my father said without blinking. The drive back from my parents' house in Albany left me hollow. My father's ultimatum echoing in my head like a bad song stuck on repeat. I gripped the steering wheel, the dark roads of upstate New York blurring past until I pulled into the driveway of my Victorian home in Troy. Its gabled roof and wraparound porch glowed faintly under the moonlight, a beacon of everything I'd built and everything they wanted to take. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the oak floorboards grounding me, but my chest still ached with betrayal. This house wasn't just a place to live. It was my refuge, my testament to surviving the worst loss of my life. 5 years ago, Thomas was taken from me in a car accident, a sudden, cruel theft that left me unmoored at 47. The life insurance payout, a sum I'd never imagined needing, became the foundation for this house. We'd dreamed of it together, a Victorian with tall windows, a garden for his roses, a study where I could grade papers late into the night. After he was gone, I poured every cent into making that dream real, buying this fixer-upper in Troy, when I could barely get out of bed. The realtor had warned it needed work, peeling paint, a leaky roof, wiring from another era, but I saw it as a second chance. If I could rebuild this house, I could rebuild myself. So I did, one nail, one tear at a time. The first year was the hardest. I'd wake up to an empty bed, the silence screaming his absence, and force myself to pick up a paintbrush or a trowel. I sanded the staircase until my hands blistered each swipe away to scrub away the grief. I planted the rose garden Thomas had sketched in an old notebook, choosing hybrid teas in crimson and blush, their blooms a living echo of his love for color. The townsfolk thought I was mad a widow, sinking her savings into a crumbling relic, but every repaired shutter and polished banister was a victory. I'd sit on the porch at dusk, the scent of roses mixing with fresh paint, and feel a flicker of pride. I was learning to live again, not just for me, but for the promises Thomas and I had made. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was my heart rebuilt from the ashes. That night after the dinner, I couldn't sleep. My parents' demand to sell felt like a demand to erase Thomas to undo everything I'd fought for. I wandered the house, my fingers tracing the wainscoting, the cool glass of the windows. In the kitchen, I noticed a loose baseboard near the pantry, one I'd meant to fix for months. It wiggled under my touch, revealing a small gap. Curious, I pried it open with a butter knife, expecting dust or mouse droppings. Instead, I found a tightly folded envelope yellowed with age tucked into the hollow space. My breath caught as I unfolded it, the paper brittle but intact. The handwriting was my grandmother Beatrice's, precise, elegant, the kind she used for Christmas cards when I was a child. Beatrice had lived in this house decades ago, before my parents sold it in the 80s. I'd bought it back without knowing its history, drawn to its charm, never imagining it held her secrets. The letter was addressed to me, dated 20 years ago when I was in my 30s, and Beatrice was still sharp despite her age. It began with an apology. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've found your way back to this house. I hid this where only you would look because you've always seen what others miss. My eyes stung as I read on. She wrote of her love for this house, how she'd raised my mother here, how it had been her sanctuary through her own losses. But then the tone shifted, cryptic and heavy. There are truths your mother and sister keep from you. Truths I've shielded you from. Trust this house to show you when the time is right. I frowned, confused. Beatrice had always been cryptic, but this felt different, urgent, almost warning. As I turned the letter over, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I bent down, my heart pounding, and picked up a faded photograph, its edges curling with age. The image showed 3 figures. My mother young and smiling, her hair in a 70s perm. Margaret maybe 10 with pigtails and a smug grin. And a man I didn't recognize. He was tall with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes, standing close to my mother, his hand on her shoulder. My father Arthur, the man who'd just disowned me, was nowhere in the frame. A chill ran through me. Beatrice's letter hadn't named him, but the implication was clear, woven into her careful words. This man, a stranger to me, was tied to my family in a way I'd never been told. My hands trembled as I studied his face, searching for something familiar, some hint of myself. Was he my real father, hidden all these years? The thought was a knife twisting with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I sat back, the letter and photo in my lap, the kitchen clock ticking softly. The house, my haven, suddenly felt alive with secrets, its walls holding more than memories of Thomas. Beatrice had known something big enough to hide in a letter. Something my mother and Margaret had kept from me. The betrayal from dinner stung sharper, now layered with this new mystery. Why had Beatrice concealed this? What else was my family hiding? I clutched the photo, my mind racing the roses outside, swaying in the night breeze as if whispering her secrets. A faded photo falls out, showing my mom's sister, and a man she doesn't recognize as her true father. I sat at my kitchen table, the faded photograph, and grandmother Beatrice's letter staring back at me like ghosts, demanding answers. The man in the photo, his dark eyes unfamiliar yet hauntingly close, had shaken something loose in me, a crack in the foundation of my family's story. But even as questions about my origins swirled, the sting of my parents' demand to sell my house burned hotter. Their words from that dinner in Albany clung to me especially. Margaret's plea, her voice dripping with desperation, and something else, entitlement. She'd always been the one they saved, the one they chose while I was left to pick up the pieces. The weight of that truth pressed down as I sipped my tea, the steam curling in the dim light of my Victorian home. Growing up, Margaret was the sun, and I was the shadow. At 55, she was 3 years older, but the gap felt wider, carved by our parents' uneven love. I remembered her at 22, fresh out of college, racking up credit card debt on designer clothes and vacations she couldn't afford. When the bills came due, my parents didn't hesitate. They paid them off, draining their savings while telling me, "She's young, Eleanor. She'll learn." I was 19 working part-time at a bookstore to pay for my own tuition, never asking for a dime. By the time Margaret was 30, she'd launched a boutique in Syracuse, a flashy venture selling overpriced scarves and candles. It collapsed in a year, leaving a trail of unpaid suppliers. Again, my parents stepped in, selling their old car to cover her debts while I was lectured about family duty when I suggested she face the consequences. Each time their voices were gentle with her, stern with me, as if my stability was a given and her chaos was a crisis only they could fix. The pattern wasn't new, even in childhood. When we were kids, Margaret got the bigger bedroom because she needed space for her creativity while I slept in a converted attic. If we fought, I was the one sent to my room, told to be the bigger person because Margaret's sensitive. I learned early to rely on myself, saving birthday money for school supplies, while Margaret spent hers on toys, knowing Mom would replace them if they broke. By high school, I was the one who studied late-earned scholarships and built a life without handouts. Margaret flitted through life, her mistakes cushioned by our parents' endless forgiveness. I didn't resent her then, not really. I thought it was just how families worked. But now, sitting in the house I'd built from my own grief, their demand to sacrifice it for her felt like a final betrayal. Margaret's latest mess was no surprise, but its scale shocked me. My father's words from the dinner replayed nearly $900,000 in debt, a staggering sum owed to loan sharks, and an ex-boyfriend with a vendetta. I didn't know the details. Margaret hadn't offered any, and my parents hadn't either, but I could piece it together. She'd always chased glamour, flitting from one bad idea to the next. There was the time she invested in a friend's nightclub in Miami, only for it to shutter when the owner skipped town. Then came the luxury car she leased, defaulting on payments when her consulting gigs dried up. The ex-boyfriend, I guessed, was some smooth talker she'd met in her endless pursuit of status, someone who'd lent her money she couldn't repay. Loan sharks were new, though dangerous, reckless a sign she'd spiraled deeper than ever. I pictured her in her sleek apartment surrounded by designer bags and unpaid bills, expecting someone else to clean it up. I stood pacing the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the hardwood. My house, this sanctuary bought with Thomas's life insurance, was my proof of survival. I'd rebuilt it, and myself, after his death, sanding floors until my hands bled, planting roses to honor his memory. Margaret had no part in that. She hadn't called when Thomas died, hadn't visited when I was drowning in grief. Yet now her crisis was my burden. My parents' logic twisted in my mind. I had a job, a steady income as a professor, so I could start over. Margaret, with her debts and drama, couldn't. It was the same excuse they'd used my whole life. She was fragile. I was strong, so I should give. I stopped at the window, staring at the rose garden, its blooms ghostly in the dark. The unfairness choked me. I'd never asked for their help, not when I was scraping by in college, not when I lost Thomas. But Margaret's failures were always a family emergency, and I was always the one expected to fix them. I thought of the dinner, her silence as our parents laid out their plan. She hadn't even apologized, just called me Ellie, a nickname she knew grated on me, and said she was drowning. As if I wasn't. As if my home, my heart was just collateral for her mistakes. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling. The photograph from Beatrice's letter lay on the table, that stranger's face a reminder of secrets I didn't yet understand. But Margaret's pattern was clear, etched into decades of our lives. She'd always been the one who took, who broke, who was saved. And now they wanted my house, my everything, to bail her out again. My mother's voice from the dinner cut through my thoughts, calm and unyielding, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She needs the house more than you do," Mom said flatly. The weight of my mother's words. "She needs the house more than you do," clung to me like damp air, as I sat in my kitchen, the photograph from Beatrice's letter still lying on the table. Margaret's lifetime of failures, propped up by our parents' endless rescues, played in my mind, each memory a brick in the wall of resentment growing inside me. I couldn't let them take my home, the one I'd built from Thomas's life insurance, the one that held my soul together after his death. But fighting openly would only deepen the rift, and I wasn't ready to lose what little family I had left. I needed a plan, one they wouldn't see coming. The next morning, I called my mother. My voice was steady, practiced as I told her I'd sell the house. "I'll do it for Margaret," I said, the lie tasting bitter. "But I need a few weeks to get things in order, paperwork, packing, finding a place to go." There was a pause, then relief in her tone as if she'd expected a fight. "That's reasonable, Eleanor," she said. "We knew you'd come around." I hung up my hands, shaking, but not from fear. Anger had sharpened into resolve. Those weeks weren't for packing. They were for outmaneuvering them. I'd play the dutiful daughter, the one who always sacrificed while building a shield around what was mine. They thought they knew me, but they'd underestimated how far I'd go to protect my home. I drove to Albany that afternoon, the autumn leaves a blur of red and gold, to meet a lawyer I'd found online. Patricia Coleman was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, her office a small suite tucked above a bookstore. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her sharp eyes sized me up as I explained my situation. Not the family drama, just the need to sell my house discreetly to a third party. I want it airtight. I told her so no one can contest it. She nodded, jotting notes, and asked for the deed and my financial records. "You own it outright?" she asked, glancing up. "No mortgage," I confirmed, explaining the life insurance payout that had bought it. "Good," she said. "That makes it clean. I'll find a buyer through a trust, keep your name off the public records as much as possible." Her efficiency was a lifeline, and I left her office feeling lighter, like I'd taken the first step on a tightrope I could actually cross. Back home, I realized I needed more than legal protection. My parents and Margaret were desperate people talk, and I needed to know what they weren't telling me. The photograph and Beatrice's cryptic letter had already shown me their secrets ran deeper than I'd imagined. I ordered a set of small recording devices online, the kind advertised for home security, with microphones sensitive enough to catch whispers. They arrived 2 days later, discreet black squares no bigger than a quarter. I spent an evening placing them carefully, one behind a bookshelf in the living room, another under the kitchen counter, a third in the hallway near the front door. I tested them with an app on my phone, my voice echoing back clear as day. If my family came to check on me, I'd hear every word. It felt strange turning my sanctuary into a trap, but their betrayal had changed the rules. I wasn't just defending my house, I was defending myself. For the next week, I played my part. I answered my mother's calls, updating her on progress with fake realtor appointments and packing plans. I'm sorting through Thomas's things, I'd say, letting my voice crack just enough to sell the story. Margaret texted once, a half-hearted "thanks, Ellie," that made my skin crawl. I didn't respond. Instead, I checked the recordings daily, downloading files to a hidden folder on my laptop. Most were mundane, my own footsteps, the hum of the fridge, a neighbor's dog barking. But on the 8th night, as I sat in my study grading papers, the app pinged with new audio. My parents and Margaret had come over unannounced that afternoon, assuming I was at work. I'd been at the college library preparing a lecture, oblivious to their visit. I plugged in my earbuds, my pulse quickening, and played the file. Their voices filled my ears, muffled at first, but clear enough. My mother's tone was sharp, impatient. "She's taking too long," she said. "What if she changes her mind?" Margaret's voice, whiny and defensive, cut in. "She won't. She never does. You know, Ellie." My father grunted, his footsteps heavy on the living room floor. "This house is worth more than we thought," he said. "The realtor I called said 2 million, maybe more. That'll cover everything and then some." I froze, my breath shallow. They'd already priced my home as if it were theirs to sell. The conversation shifted, their voices lowering, and I leaned closer to my laptop, straining to hear. My mother spoke again, barely above a whisper, her words sending a chill through me. "If she finds out," she said, "we'll all go down." I replayed it, certain I'd misheard, but there it was, her voice low and urgent, hiding something bigger than Margaret's debts. What could unravel them all? The photograph flashed in my mind, that stranger's face, and I wondered what else they'd kept from me. I sat back, the study's lamplight casting long shadows. My plan was in motion. Patricia was working on the sale, the recorders were catching their secrets, but that whisper changed everything. It wasn't just about saving Margaret anymore. There was something they feared, something they thought I might uncover. I'd bought time, but now I needed answers. If she finds out, her mom whispers on the recording, we'll all go down. My mother's whispered warning on the recording. If she finds out, we'll all go down, looped in my mind as I sat in my study, the weight of her words fueling my resolve. The photograph of that mysterious man tucked away by grandmother Beatrice hinted at secrets my family buried deep. But their demand to sell my house for Margaret's debts was the immediate betrayal I had to counter. My lawyer Patricia was working on a discreet sale, and the hidden recorders were catching their whispers. But I needed a buyer, someone who'd make this more than a transaction. Someone who'd make them feel the cost of their greed. That's when I remembered Victor Marshall, a name from a past my family thought they'd erased. I hadn't thought of Victor in years, but his name surfaced like a ghost from the edges of my memory. He'd been a friend of my parents in their younger days, back when we all lived in Albany before I bought my Victorian home in Troy. Victor was a quiet man, always in a neat suit, running a small lending business that helped people like my parents buy their first home. Margaret, in her early 30s, had borrowed heavily from him for one of her schemes, a luxury event planning venture that collapsed in a flurry of unpaid vendors and bounced checks. When it failed, my parents didn't just cover her debts. They turned on Victor, accusing him of predatory lending, spreading rumors that he'd tricked Margaret into bad terms. I was in my late 20s then, newly married to Thomas, and I remembered the whispers at family dinners painting Victor as a villain. He'd been fair, even generous, but my family needed a scapegoat. They cut him out and he vanished from our lives, his reputation tarnished. Now at 58, he was a successful businessman running a real estate investment company in Syracuse. If anyone understood Margaret's trail of destruction, it was him. I found his contact through a quick online search. His company's website, sleek and professional, a far cry from the modest office he'd once had. My hands hesitated over the phone, the weight of reaching out to someone my family had wronged pressing on me. But Victor was perfect, not just a buyer, but a reckoning. I dialed and he answered on the third ring, his voice deep and cautious. Eleanor Hayes. I said, my throat tight. You might remember me as Eleanor Thompson. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. I never forget a name, he said. What's this about? I asked to meet, keeping it vague, and he agreed to coffee in Syracuse the next day. As I hung up, a spark of hope flickered. Victor might be the key to turning their betrayal back on them. The drive to Syracuse was crisp, the October air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. Victor was already at the cafe when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, his salt and pepper hair cropped short, his suit still impeccable. His eyes, though, held a hardness I didn't remember, a resentment time hadn't softened. I slid into the booth, clutching my coffee, and got straight to the point. I'm selling my house, I said, and I want you to buy it. His brow arched, but he didn't interrupt. I explained the situation, not the full family drama, just enough Margaret's $900,000 debt, my parents' demand to sell, my need for a buyer who'd keep it quiet. Why me? He asked, leaning back, his voice edged with suspicion. I took a breath and told him the truth. Because you know what Margaret's done. To you, to others. This isn't just a sale, it's a chance to settle a score. Victor's face tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd walk away. Then he leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table. They ruined me back then, he said quietly. Your parents spread lies, said I preyed on your sister. I lost clients' friends. Took years to rebuild. His resentment mirrored mine, a shared wound from my family's betrayal. I nodded, letting him see my own anger. They're doing it again, I said. To me. We sat in silence, the cafe's hum fading around us. Then he asked about the house, its value roughly $2 million, its clear title from Thomas's life insurance. "I'll buy it," he said finally. "Through my company Anonymous Trust. Your family won't know until it's done." I asked if he was sure, knowing the history he carried. His smile was sharp, almost predatory. "I'm sure. Let's make it hurt." We met again 2 days later at Patricia's office to finalize details. Victor's company, Marshall Properties, would purchase through a trust, keeping my involvement and his identity hidden until the deed was signed. Patricia laid out the paperwork, her calm efficiency a contrast to the storm in my chest. "This is ironclad," she said, sliding the contract across her desk. "No one can challenge it once it's filed." Victor signed, first his pen moving with deliberate precision, then handed it to me. My hand shook as I added my signature, not from doubt, but from the weight of what I was setting in motion. This wasn't just about saving my home, it was about making them face the consequences of their choices. Victor stood adjusting his cufflinks and looked at me with a glint in his eye. When they opened the door, he said, "They'll know the debt has come due." I drove home, the contract locked in my glove box, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Victor's involvement was the twist I needed, tying Margaret's past sins to her present crisis. My family thought they'd won, thought I'd bend as I always had. But I was done being their fallback. The recorders were still running, Patricia was filing the sale, and Victor was ready to step into their trap. Whatever secrets they feared I'd uncover, I was closer than they knew. When they opened the door, he said, "They'll know the debt has come due." Victor's parting words. "When they open the door, they'll know the debt has come due," rang in my ears as I drove back from Syracuse, the signed contract locked in my glove box. My heart thrummed with a mix of dread and exhilaration, knowing I'd set something irreversible in motion. My Victorian home in Troy, the one I'd built from Thomas's life insurance, was no longer mine on paper, but the plan was far from over. My family thought I was sacrificing it for Margaret's debts, bending to their will as always. I'd let them believe that, play the dutiful daughter one last time while the truth waited like a trap ready to spring. The next morning, I stood in my lawyer Patricia's office, the air thick with the scent of coffee and old books. The deed transfer was ready, a stack of crisp documents detailing the sale to Victor's company, Marshall Properties, through an anonymous trust. Patricia slid the pen toward me, her eyes steady. "Once you sign, it's done," she said. "The house belongs to the trust. No turning back." I nodded, my hand steady as I signed my name, Eleanor Hayes. Each stroke a quiet rebellion. The ink dried quickly, but my chest felt heavy as if I were signing away a piece of my soul. This house was more than walls. It was where I'd rebuilt myself after Thomas's death, where I'd learned to breathe again. But I wasn't losing it, not really. I was rewriting its ending and my family's too. Moving out was the hardest part. I had 2 weeks before the trust officially took possession, and I needed to keep up the illusion that I was preparing to hand the house to Margaret. I packed slowly, deliberately, filling boxes with clothes and books, but leaving the essentials untouched. The rose-patterned curtains, Thomas loved the oak dining table we'd bought together, the framed art prints I'd hung with care. I wanted the house to look lived in, as if I'd return any moment so my parents and Margaret wouldn't suspect a thing. I rented a small storage unit in Albany for my personal belongings, driving back and forth under the guise of house hunting. Each trip I glanced at the rose garden, its blooms still vibrant despite the October chill, and whispered a promise to Thomas that I wasn't letting go, not in the way they thought. My family played their part in the charade, unaware of mine. My mother called twice that week, her voice syrupy with approval. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor," she said during one call, as if I needed her blessing. "Margaret's so grateful," I murmured agreement, my stomach twisting at the lie. Margaret texted me updates about her plans for the house, vague ideas about renting it out or selling it herself once her debts were cleared. "It'll be a fresh start," she wrote, and I could almost see her smug smile, assuming she'd won again. My father was quieter, sending a single message, "Realtors coming next week to appraise. Be ready." I replied with a curt, "Okay," knowing they'd walk into something far different than they expected. In the evenings, I focused on the recordings, the tiny devices I'd hidden around the house, still capturing every sound. I sat in my study earbuds and listening to hours of silence punctuated by my own footsteps or the hum of the furnace. But one night, as I sorted through files on my laptop, I found a new clip from the living room recorder. My parents had visited again unannounced while I was at the college teaching a late class. Their voices were low, cautious, as if they knew the walls might listen. "She's packing," my mother said, her tone satisfied. I saw boxes in the hall. My father grunted. "Good. The sooner this is over, the better." There was a pause. Then Margaret's voice sharp with impatience. "She better not back out. I need this." I clenched my fists, their casual dismissal of my life stoking the fire in me. I downloaded every file, hours of their conversations, their assumptions, their greed, and emailed them to Patricia. "Keep these safe," I wrote. "They're my insurance." She replied within the hour. "Got them. Stored securely." Those recordings were my shield proof of their intentions if they ever tried to twist the story later. By the end of the second week, I was ready. I loaded the last of my boxes into my car, leaving the house exactly as it had been. Curtains drawn, furniture in place, even a vase of fresh roses on the kitchen counter. I wanted my family to walk in and see the life they thought they could claim, oblivious to the truth waiting for them. I moved into a temporary apartment in Albany, a cramped one-bedroom with beige walls and no charm, but it was enough for now. My final night in the house, I walked through each room, my fingers trailing over the banister, the fireplace, the window where I'd watched the roses bloom. I wasn't saying goodbye. Not really, I was setting the stage. My parents and Margaret believed the house would be theirs to save her from her $900,000 debt that I'd folded under their pressure as I always had. They were wrong. As I locked the front door for the last time, the key heavy in my hand, I felt a strange calm. Patricia had confirmed the sale was final, the trust now in control. Victor was ready, his own score to settle. The recordings were safe, a weapon I could wield if needed. My family would walk into my home expecting victory, but I'd rewritten the ending. I climbed into my car, the engine humming to life, and drove away, the house fading in my rearview mirror. They'd find out soon enough, but by then it'd be too late. By the time they figure it out, it'll be history. The last glimpse of my Victorian home fading in my rearview mirror stayed with me as I settled into my temporary Albany apartment, its beige walls a stark contrast to the life I'd left behind. I'd signed the deed, moved out, and left everything, curtains, furniture, even the roses, untouched to keep my family believing I was handing the house to Margaret. The secret recordings were safe with my lawyer, Patricia, and Victor. The buyer was poised to deliver the blow. My parents and sister thought they'd won, but the trap was set, and I was miles away waiting for it to spring. 5 days later, I got a text from my father, realtors inspecting the house today. "Be there." I didn't respond. I wasn't supposed to be there. My absence was part of the plan, letting them walk into the house expecting it to be empty or mine to claim. I imagined them pulling up to the Troy property, my mother clutching her purse. Margaret already planning how to turn my home into her salvation from her $900,000 debt. The realtor, some local agent my father had hired to appraise the house for Margaret's fresh start, would be there too, clipboard in hand, oblivious to the truth. I sat in my apartment sipping coffee that tasted like cardboard, my phone silent but my nerves electric. Victor had promised to handle the rest, and I trusted him to make them feel the weight of their betrayal. I pictured the scene unfolding as the October sun cast long shadows across my rose garden. My parents' old sedan would crunch up the gravel driveway, followed by the realtor's sleek SUV. My mother, Evelyn, would step out first, her coat buttoned tight against the chill, her face set with that familiar mix of determination and impatience. My father, Arthur, would follow, his shoulders squared like he was marching into battle. Margaret would trail behind her heels, clicking, probably texting someone about her plans to flip the house. They'd walk up the porch steps past the roses I'd planted for Thomas, expecting an empty house. Or maybe me packing the last of my things in defeat. The front door, freshly painted a deep green at my mother's suggestion to boost curb appeal, would loom before them. They'd knock confident, ready to claim what they thought was theirs. Instead, Victor opened the door. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine his tall frame filling the doorway, his salt and pepper hair neat, his suit crisp as always. His presence would be a shock, a ghost from a past my family thought they'd buried. Victor Marshall, the man they'd accused of predatory lending when Margaret defaulted on her loans years ago. The man they'd slandered and cast out, now stood in my home, their supposed prize. I pictured my mother's hand flying to her chest, her eyes widening as she recognized him. My father's jaw would tighten, his fists clenching at the sight of a man he'd once called a crook. And Margaret, oh Margaret, would freeze, her polished facade crumbling, as she realized the creditor she'd wronged was now the master of the house she'd planned to take. Victor would stand calm, his voice steady but edged with a satisfaction he'd waited years to feel. He'd introduce himself as the new owner, the words landing like a gavel. "I bought it," he'd say, gesturing to the house behind him, my rose-patterned curtains still hanging my furniture untouched. The realtor, a middle-aged woman named Karen with a clipboard and a forced smile, would stammer confused, checking her notes. "But we were told the owner would be here," she'd say, glancing at my parents. My father would step forward, his voice rising. "What's going on? Where's Eleanor?" Victor wouldn't flinch. He'd explain the sale was final, the deed transferred through his company's trust, all legal and binding. My mother would interrupt, her voice shrill, demanding answers, but Victor would hold up a hand, silencing her. "You wanted this house for Margaret's debts," he'd say, his gaze locking on my sister. "Now it's mine." Margaret's reaction would be the sharpest. I could see her face draining of color, her lips parting as recognition hit. She'd known Victor in her 30s when she'd borrowed thousands from him for her failed event planning business, then dodged repayment while my parents spread lies about his character. His name would hit her like a slap, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape. "You," she'd whisper, her voice breaking. The realtor would shuffle awkwardly, sensing the tension but not understanding it. My parents would exchange glances, their confidence unraveling. My mother might try to argue, citing their agreement with me, but Victor would cut her off, his tone cold. "Eleanor sold it. Fair and square. You'll have to take it up with her." I sat in my apartment, imagining their shock, their voices overlapping in confusion and anger. The house they'd demanded, the one I'd built from Thomas's memory, was no longer theirs to claim. Victor's presence was the first crack in their plan, a twist they hadn't seen coming. I hadn't been there to witness it, but I didn't need to be. The thought of Margaret's face pale with the realization that her old creditor now held her supposed salvation was enough. My parents would be furious, their control slipping, but they'd have no ground to stand on. The sale was done, the truth waiting to unfold. I leaned back in my chair, my coffee cold, a quiet thrill running through me. They'd walked into my home expecting victory, but Victor had turned the key. The recording safely with Patricia would protect me if they tried to fight back. Whatever secrets they feared I'd uncover, whatever going down my mother had whispered about, I was one step closer to unraveling. Victor's final words to them, delivered with that sharp smile I'd seen in Syracuse, would linger in their minds, a promise of consequences they couldn't yet grasp. "Welcome home," he said. Or should I say, payback time. I wasn't there when Victor opened the door of my Victorian home to my stunned family. His words, "Welcome home," or should I say, payback time, cutting through their expectations like a blade. From my bare Albany apartment, I could only imagine their faces. Margaret's paling as she recognized her old creditor. My parents' confusion twisting into anger. The house they thought they'd claim for Margaret's debts now belonged to Victor, and I'd orchestrated it all. But the plan wasn't finished. Victor had promised to deliver the next blow, and as I waited for his call, my fingers drumming on the coffee table, I knew the truth was about to hit them harder than they could imagine. Victor called that evening, his voice steady, but tinged with satisfaction. "It's done," he said. "They're reeling. Meet me tomorrow at the house noon. There's more you need to know." I barely slept, my mind racing with what he'd meant. The next day I drove to Troy, the familiar sight of my rose garden, tightening my chest as I parked a block away. Victor had asked me to come alone to keep my presence quiet until the moment was right. I slipped through the back gate, avoiding the front where my family might still linger, and found Victor in the living room, standing by the fireplace I'd restored. He held a manila folder, his suit as sharp as ever, but his eyes carried a weight I hadn't seen in Syracuse. "They're outside with the realtor," he said, nodding toward the front porch. "Your parents are demanding answers, and Margaret's a mess. But they don't know the half of it." He opened the folder, revealing the deed and a contract I'd signed in his office. "You're not just the seller, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "You're a co-investor. I used your savings, $57,000 from your personal account, to secure a stake in the trust that owns this house. Legally, you're a part owner." My breath caught. When I'd given Patricia my savings to strengthen the deal, I hadn't realized Victor would structure it this way. The house wasn't gone, it was still partly mine, hidden behind his company's name. "It's airtight," he added, tapping the papers. "They can't touch it." I stared at the documents, my signature alongside his, binding me to the property in a way my family would never suspect. Why, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why give me a stake? Victor's jaw tightened and he looked away toward the rose-patterned curtains Thomas had loved. "Because of Thomas," he said. "He was my friend long before your family turned on me. He knew things about them." My heart skipped. Thomas had never mentioned Victor, but they'd grown up in the same circles, their paths crossing before we married. Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn book, a poetry collection Thomas had cherished, its pages yellowed. "He gave this to me a year before he died," Victor said. "Said it held answers you'd need one day." I took the book, my hands trembling as I opened it. Tucked inside was a folded note in Beatrice's elegant handwriting dated a decade ago when Thomas was still alive. It was brief, cryptic: "Tell Eleanor the truth about her father when she's ready. They've lied to her, but the house will protect her." My knees weakened and I sank onto the couch. The photograph I'd found my mother Margaret and that unfamiliar man flashed in my mind. Beatrice had hinted he was my real father. And now Thomas had known, carrying her secret in this book he'd passed to Victor. "He wanted you to have a way out," Victor said. "He knew your family would come for what's yours." I clutched the book, my throat tight with the weight of Thomas's foresight. He'd loved this house as much as I did, and even in death he was shielding me. Before I could speak, the front door rattled and my mother's voice carried through, sharp and demanding. "Victor, open this door." Victor motioned for me to stay hidden, then strode to the entrance, letting them in. I peered from behind the living room doorway, my pulse racing. My mother stormed in first, her coat flapping, followed by my father, his face red, and Margaret, her eyes puffy and wide. The realtor, Karen, hovered behind, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "You have no right," my mother snapped, pointing at Victor. This was supposed to be Margaret's. Victor held up the deed, calm as stone. "Eleanor sold it to my company, and she's not just the seller, she's a co-investor. This house is hers too." My mother's mouth fell open, her words dying. My father's fists clenched, but he said nothing, his eyes darting to Margaret, who looked like she'd been slapped. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She planned this." Victor nodded, his gaze locking on my mother. "And Thomas knew your secrets," he said. "He left a note with me from Beatrice. About her real father." My mother's face went ashen, her hand gripping the arm of a chair. Margaret gasped, her gaze flicking to our mother as if searching for confirmation of a truth she'd suspected. My father stood frozen, his authority crumbling. Victor handed them copies of the contract, the trust's terms clear and unbreakable. "It's done," he said. "The house is ours. You have no claim." My mother tried to speak, her voice a hoarse croak, but no words came. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of rage, her hands shaking as she clutched the papers. The realtor stammered an excuse and slipped out, leaving my family to face the wreckage of their plan. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding, Thomas's book heavy in my hands. Victor's voice cut through the silence, low and deliberate, as he looked at my mother. "She didn't sell out the family," the man said. "She just stopped paying for it." I stood hidden behind the living room doorway of my Troy home, clutching Thomas's poetry book with Beatrice's note, my heart pounding as Victor's words landed like a grenade. "She didn't sell out the family. She just stopped paying for it." My mother's face ashen and speechless, and Margaret's tearful rage confirmed the blow had hit. They thought they'd claim my house for her debts, but Victor, my co-investor and their old scapegoat, had turned their plan to dust. I slipped out the back before they could see me, driving to my Albany apartment with a quiet thrill. The truth was out, but the storm was just beginning. Back in my cramped rental, the beige walls closing in, I braced for their retaliation. It started that evening, my phone buzzing with texts from my mother. "How could you do this to us?" She wrote, her words sharp with accusation. "You've ruined Margaret's life." My father's messages were colder clipped, selfish. "Always knew you were." I didn't respond, letting their anger pile up unread. Margaret was quieter at first, but by morning my phone lit up with notifications from social media. She'd taken to her public profiles, posting a tearful video from her sleek Syracuse apartment, her mascara-streaked face framed by perfect lighting. "My own sister betrayed me," she sobbed, her voice trembling for effect. "She sold our family home out from under me, left me to drown in debt. I thought we were family." The video ended with her dabbing her eyes, the comments flooding with sympathy from strangers and her circle of enablers. I watched it once, my jaw tight, then closed the app. She was playing the victim as always, painting me as the villain who'd stolen her salvation. By the next day, the drama had spread like wildfire. Margaret's video racked up thousands of views, shared across local Syracuse and Albany groups. Friends of hers I barely knew posted their own takes, calling me heartless, a greedy professor hoarding a $2 million house, while my sister faced ruin. Random strangers chimed in their comments. "Vicious. What kind of sister does that? She deserves to lose everything." I scrolled through the vitriol on my laptop, my coffee growing cold, each word a stab. I'd expected pushback, but the speed and venom of it shook me. My parents fueled the fire, my mother leaving voicemails that I deleted unheard, their tone clear from the notifications. "Call me back. Eleanor. Fix this." Margaret posted another video, this one outside my Troy house, the rose garden in the background like a mockery of my loss. "This was supposed to save me," she said, her voice breaking artfully. "Now it's gone because of her." I stayed silent, but the weight of their attacks pressed on me. I'd moved out, left the house intact to keep up the illusion, but now it was a stage for Margaret's performance. I checked the news sites, half expecting her to escalate further, and found nothing yet. I paced my apartment, the linoleum floor cold under my feet, and tried to focus. Victor had the deed, Patricia had the recordings, and I had a stake in the house they didn't know about. But the public onslaught was a new battle, one I hadn't prepared for. I wanted to fight back, to tell the world about Margaret's debts, my parents' favoritism, the secrets they hid. But I held back, knowing timing was everything. On the third day, the drama caught the eye of the Albany Times, a local paper known for sniffing out juicy stories. A reporter named Clara Evans emailed me her message, polite, but pointed. "We're covering the sale of your Troy property valued at $2 million. Sources claim it was a deliberate act to block your sister's financial recovery. Can we schedule an interview?" I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The story had grown legs, and Margaret's tearful videos had fed it. By evening, the paper published a headline online: "Woman sells $2 million family home in shocking revenge plot." The article was short, speculative, citing anonymous sources, and Margaret's posts painting me as a calculating sister who'd sold out her family. It mentioned Victor only as an unnamed buyer, keeping his identity, and mine as co-investor hidden just as we'd planned. But the final line stopped me cold. The Times is seeking comment from Eleanor Hayes, the woman behind the sale. I leaned back, my hands trembling. The world was watching now, and Margaret's narrative was winning. Her videos had turned our private betrayal into a public spectacle, and my parents' silence on social media only amplified her story. I thought of calling Victor, but he'd done his part standing in my home as the new owner delivering the first blow. The recordings safely with Patricia were my ace, but I wasn't ready to play them. Not yet. I needed to let the pressure build, let Margaret and my parents think they could shame me into submission. I'd spent my life being the reliable one, the one who sacrificed while they took. Now their lies were unraveling in front of an audience they'd invited. I walked to the apartment's small window, staring at the gray Albany skyline. The newspaper's request for an interview hung over me, a chance to tell my side, or a trap to make me look worse. Margaret's videos were convincing, her tears practiced, but they didn't know what I knew. The secret about my real father hinted at by Beatrice's note, and confirmed by Victor's revelation. They didn't know I still held a stake in the house, a truth that would hit harder than their accusations. As I stood there, my phone buzzed again, another email from Clara Evans, this one more direct. We'd like to interview the woman who sold a $2 million house for revenge. The newspaper's email. We'd like to interview the woman who sold a $2 million house for revenge, glowed on my laptop screen, a stark reminder that my family's betrayal had spilled into the public eye. Margaret's tearful videos and my parents' venomous texts had painted me as the villain, and the Albany Times was circling hungry for a story. I hadn't responded, not yet, letting their accusations pile up while I held my secrets close, the recordings, my co-ownership with Victor, and the truth about my real father hinted at by Beatrice's note. But the weight of it all pressed on me, and in my cramped Albany apartment, I needed grounding. I turned to the one thing that had always steadied me, the past preserved in the relics Beatrice had left behind. I'd brought a few boxes from my Troy home when I moved out, careful to keep up the illusion that I was handing the house to Margaret. One of those boxes held Beatrice's old safe, a small iron box she'd kept in her attic when she lived in the house decades ago. I'd found it while packing, tucked behind a beam, its key taped to the bottom. I hadn't opened it then, too, overwhelmed by the sale and my family's pressure. But now, with their attacks echoing online, I needed her wisdom. I set the safe on my apartment's wobbly kitchen table, its surface scratched and heavy with history. The key turned with a reluctant click, and the lid creaked open, revealing a bundle of papers wrapped in a faded silk scarf. My hands trembled as I untied it, the scent of old ink and lavender, Beatrice's favorite, filling the air. At the top was a legal document, its edges crisp despite its age, labeled Last Will and Testament of Beatrice Marie Ellison. It was dated 10 years ago when I was 42 and still reeling from Thomas's death. I skimmed the formal language, my heart racing as I reached the key clause. To my granddaughter Eleanor Hayes, I bequeath my cabin in the Adirondacks located at 47 Lakeview Lane, Saranac Lake, to be granted only if she is coerced to leave her primary residence against her will. My breath caught. Beatrice had owned a cabin, a place she'd never mentioned, hidden away in the mountains. I pictured a small retreat by a lake, its existence a secret kept from my parents and Margaret. The will specified that the property was free of liens, its title held in a trust managed by Beatrice's lawyer, a man named Harold Grayson in Syracuse. If I'd been forced out of my home as I had been, this cabin was mine. Beneath the will was another document, a trust agreement from a bank I didn't recognize. It detailed a $50,000 fund, established by a man named Daniel Whitaker, described as a benefactor with no further explanation. My pulse quickened as I read the terms. The fund was, for me, managed by Grayson, to be released upon Beatrice's death, or my displacement from my home. Daniel Whitaker. The name matched the initials on the photograph I'd found in the wall, the man standing with my mother and Margaret. Beatrice's note in Thomas's book had hinted he was my real father, a truth my family had buried. This money, modest but deliberate, was his legacy to me, hidden by Beatrice until the moment I needed it most. I sat back, the papers trembling in my hands, trying to process the idea that my grandmother had planned for this exact betrayal. Tucked into the scarf was a letter, her elegant handwriting unmistakable. My dearest Eleanor. It began, "You've always been the strong one, the one who sees truth where others see convenience. If you're reading this, your family has pushed you too far, as I feared they would." My eyes stung as I read on. She wrote of her love for me, her regret for keeping secrets, and her certainty that my mother and Margaret would betray me for their own gain. "They've hidden the truth about your father," she wrote, "a good man they cast aside. This cabin and his gift are your shield. Trust yourself as I always have." The letter tied back to the photograph, her cryptic warning now clear. She'd foreseen my parents' favoritism, Margaret's greed, and their willingness to sacrifice me. She'd prepared for it, leaving me a way out. I stood pacing the small apartment, the papers spread across the table. The cabin was a lifeline, a place to start anew, far from the Troy house I'd lost to Victor's trust. The $50,000, modest compared to the house's $2 million value, was enough to rebuild, to carve out a life free of their demands. Beatrice's foresight was staggering. She'd known my family's patterns, known they'd push me to the edge. The photograph, the note in Thomas's book, and now this formed a chain of protection she'd forged across decades. I thought of my mother's whispered fear on the recording. If she finds out, we'll all go down, and realized Beatrice had given me the tools to uncover whatever they hid. I sat down, my fingers tracing her handwriting. The public meltdown outside was growing, Margaret's videos painting me as a traitor. But here, in Beatrice's words, I found strength. She'd seen this coming, not just a possibility, but a certainty. And she'd armed me with a cabin and a fund no one could touch. I pictured her in this same house years ago, hiding her secrets in walls and safes, knowing I'd find them when the time was right. The weight of her love, her trust settled over me, a quiet power against the chaos of my family's attacks. "This isn't just protection," I whispered. "It's prophecy." Beatrice's letter and will lay on my Albany apartment table, her words a quiet anchor against the storm of Margaret's videos and my parents' texts. The Adirondacks cabin and $50,000 trust fund from my real father were her final gift, a prophecy of the betrayal I'd faced. I whispered her words to myself, feeling her presence like a shield. But the public narrative Margaret had spun me as the vengeful sister who sold a $2 million house out from under her demanded a response. I couldn't hide forever. A week after discovering the safe's contents, I decided it was time to fight back. I contacted Clara Evans, the Albany Times reporter who'd requested my interview. My hands shook as I typed the email attaching the secret recordings I'd forwarded to Patricia. "I'm ready to share my side," I wrote. "Here's evidence of their demands and threats." Clara responded within hours, eager for the exclusive. We met at a quiet cafe in Albany, her notebook open, her eyes sharp but kind. I laid it all out, the dinner ambush, their ultimatum to sell my home for Margaret's debts, the hidden microphones that captured their whispers. I played the clips for her, my mother's voice low and urgent, revealing their desperation. Clara listened, jotting notes, her expression shifting from curiosity to empathy. "This flips everything," she said. "You're not the villain, you're the survivor." I nodded, my voice steady as I described rebuilding after Thomas's death, only to have my family try to strip it away. The interview lasted 2 hours, and as I left, I felt a weight lift. The truth was out. The article hit the Albany Times website the next morning, headlined, "Widow Fights Back. How a Family's Greed Sparked a $2 million House Sale Saga." Clara had woven my story with the evidence, quoting the recordings verbatim, my mother's warnings, Margaret's entitlement, my father's cold commands. She highlighted my resilience, the art history professor who'd turned grief into a home, only to defend it from her own kin. The piece went beyond facts, painting me as a woman who'd said enough, a narrative that resonated. Within hours, it spread online, shared across local forums and social media. Margaret's tearful videos, once the dominant story, were now countered by comments like, "She's the real victim. and family toxic good for her standing up. By afternoon, the story went viral. Women's communities, online groups on Facebook for widows forums, for adult children of dysfunctional families picked it up, reposting with hashtags like #FamilyBetrayal and #StandYourGround. A popular subreddit for personal finance horror stories featured its users dissecting Margaret's debts and applauding my move. Influencers in women's empowerment spaces shared clips calling it a masterclass in boundaries. One viral tweet from a life coach read, "This woman sold her house to escape family greed. Iconic resilience," with thousands of likes. I watched the tide turn from my laptop notifications flooding my email. Strangers messaged support. "You inspired me to cut off my toxic sister," one wrote. "Your story gave me strength to say no." The backlash against Margaret built quickly, her videos now mocked in comments. "Cry more, entitlement queen." My parents' silence only fueled it, their lack of defense seen as admission. Margaret felt the fallout first. Her consulting business, vague gigs in event planning and networking, relied on her polished image and connections. By evening, her social media was in flames, former clients unfollowing in droves. I learned from a mutual acquaintance that 2 big contracts, a corporate retreat and a charity gala, were canceled, the organizers citing reputational concerns. Her LinkedIn profile, once buzzing with endorsements, went quiet. Endorsements retracted as the story spread. A local Syracuse blog ran a follow-up. "Event planners' debt drama exposed. Clients flee." Margaret posted a frantic defense video, her tears less convincing now. "It's all lies." My sister twisted everything, but the comments were brutal. "Pay your own debts and stop playing victim." She lost a sponsorship deal with a boutique brand, the company issuing a statement about aligning with integrity. I didn't revel in it, but the justice felt right after years of her messes. The consequences were finally hers. The viral wave crested the next day, national outlets picking up the story. A women's magazine blogged about it under Empowerment Stories, framing me as a symbol of breaking free from family obligations. Online communities rallied, creating memes of my house with captions like, "Not for sale, my peace." A podcast on toxic relationships dedicated an episode to it, inviting listeners to share similar tales. The support poured in, emails from women across the country. "I left my family too. Your story helped." I spent hours reading them, tears blurring my screen. The narrative had flipped. I was no longer the vengeful sister, but the resilient widow who'd protected her legacy. Margaret's business ties unraveled further. A former partner publicly distanced herself, tweeting, "Can't associate with that drama." Her online store selling overpriced planners saw orders drop, reviews flooding with 1 stars, greedy like her videos. By the week's end, the story had transformed me. I'd released the evidence to reclaim my voice, and the world had listened. The backlash hit Margaret hard. Her networking group expelled her, citing negative publicity, and a key investor pulled out of her latest venture. My parents, silent in the storm, must have felt the isolation their favoritism exposed. I closed my laptop, the glow of support warming the cold apartment. But as I did, an email pinged from a national women's organization, the subject line catching my eye. "Eleanor gets invited to speak at a major conference, Women Who Walked Away." The email inviting me to speak at the Women Who Walked Away conference sat unanswered in my inbox, a beacon of possibility amid the chaos of my viral story. The Albany Times article and my released recordings had flipped the narrative, turning Margaret's tearful videos into a public spectacle of her own making, costing her business ties and reputation. Women's communities online rallied behind me, their support a warm contrast to my family's silence. In my sparse Albany apartment, I felt the tide turning, but the victory was bittersweet. Margaret's betrayal and my parents' demands still stung, and I braced for their next move, knowing they wouldn't let my defiance go unanswered. 2 days later, a knock came at my apartment door, sharp and insistent. I peered through the peephole, my heart lurching at the sight of Margaret, her face pale and drawn, standing beside her 16-year-old daughter, Lily. I hadn't seen Lily in months, not since before the dinner that started this war. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail. Her eyes downcast, clutching a backpack like a shield. Margaret's presence, though, set my nerves on edge. Her tailored coat and perfect makeup couldn't hide the desperation in her posture. I opened the door, keeping my expression neutral, and stepped aside to let them in. The small living room felt smaller with them there, the air thick with unspoken tension. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady but cold, my hands clasped to hide their trembling. Margaret didn't sit, though. Lily sank onto the couch, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Eleanor." "I'm sorry," Margaret began, her voice soft, rehearsed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. The videos, the posts, I was upset. I thought you'd understand." Her words were a plea, but they carried that familiar deflection, as if her public attacks were my fault. I crossed my arms, remembering her tearful videos blaming me for her debts, her refusal to own her $900,000 mess. "You thought I'd understand you, trying to take my home?" I said, my tone sharp. "You stood by while Mom and Dad demanded I sell everything Thomas left me." Margaret flinched, her eyes glistening, but I saw the calculation behind her tears. "I was desperate," she said. "You don't know what it's like, Ellie, to owe that much, to have people threatening you." The nickname grated, a reminder of her entitlement, as if she could charm her way out of this. Lily looked up then, her young face caught between confusion and loyalty. "Aunt Ellie." "Mom said you sold the house to hurt her," she said softly, her voice uncertain. My heart ached for her. She was caught in her mother's storm, just as I'd been for years. "Lily," I said gently, "your mom's debts aren't my responsibility. I sold the house to protect myself." Margaret cut in, her voice rising. "Protect yourself. You humiliated me. My clients are gone. My sponsors. Everything's falling apart because of you." Her deflection was textbook, blaming me for the consequences of her own actions. I shook my head, the years of her privilege flashing before me, her debts paid by our parents, her failures excused while I was told to sacrifice. "You humiliated yourself, Margaret," I said. "You made this public. You tried to take what wasn't yours." She paced, her heels clicking on the linoleum, her hands gesturing wildly. "I just wanted a way out," she said, tears spilling now less convincing than in her videos. "You could have helped me like family does. Instead, you teamed up with Victor, that vulture." Her mention of Victor, the creditor she'd wronged years ago, sparked a flicker of anger. She still saw herself as the victim, even after her lies had been exposed. "Victor was a better friend to me than you ever were," I said, my voice low. "You don't get to beg forgiveness while pointing fingers." Lily's eyes widened and she hugged her backpack tighter, caught in the crossfire of our words. I took a breath, steadying myself. I'd spent decades bending to Margaret's needs, swallowing my hurt to keep the peace. But the recordings, the viral story, and Beatrice's will had shown me I didn't have to anymore. "I'm done, Margaret," I said, my voice firm. "No more contact. I won't keep carrying your mistakes." Her face crumpled, but it was the shock of being refused that hit her, not remorse. "You're cutting me off," she whispered, as if the idea was unthinkable. After everything we've been through, I knotted my resolve like steel. "You crossed a line when you tried to take my home. I'm breaking that cycle now." Lily looked between us, her expression torn, but I couldn't soften for her sake, not this time. The toxic pattern of my family's favoritism ended here with me. Margaret stopped pacing, her hands falling to her sides. For a moment, I thought she'd leave her pride wounded, but intact. But then she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper as if Lily shouldn't hear. "There's something you need to know," she said, her eyes searching mine, a flicker of something genuine breaking through her act. I braced myself, expecting another manipulation, but her next words hit like a punch. "Mom's dying," she whispered. "She wants to see you." My breath caught the room tilting. My mother Evelyn, frail and distant in my mind, hadn't been part of the public fallout, but this news landed like a stone. Margaret's face held no triumph, only a quiet urgency, and Lily's soft gasp confirmed it wasn't a lie. I stood frozen, the weight of my decision to cut contact colliding with this new reality. "Mom's dying," she whispers. "She wants to see you." Margaret's whispered bombshell. "Mom's dying. She wants to see you," hung in the air of my Albany apartment, her words a jolt that cracked my resolve to cut her off. Lily's soft gasp and Margaret's fleeting sincerity made it impossible to dismiss as another manipulation. My mother Evelyn had been a distant figure in the public storm, her silence overshadowed by Margaret's videos and my father's texts. But now the weight of her illness pulled me back, demanding a reckoning I wasn't sure I was ready for. Beatrice's letter with its warnings of betrayal sat in my bag as I drove to the hospital ready to face the woman who demanded my home for Margaret's debts. The Albany Medical Center was a maze of sterile hallways, the antiseptic smell sharp as I followed signs to the oncology ward. My mother's room was at the end, the door ajar, revealing her in a hospital bed smaller than I'd ever seen her. At 76, Evelyn had always been formidable, her posture rigid, her voice cutting, but now her gray hair was thin, her skin pale against the white sheets. An IV dripped beside her, and her eyes, though clouded, still held that stubborn spark. My father Arthur sat in a chair nearby, his shoulders slumped, looking older than I remembered. He stood when he saw me, his expression a mix of relief and wariness, but I kept my gaze on my mother. "You came," she said, her voice frail but laced with surprise, as if she doubted I would. I nodded, clutching my bag. Beatrice's letter heavy inside. "Margaret said you wanted to see me," I said, keeping my tone even though my heart pounded with years of unspoken hurt. She gestured weakly for me to sit, and I took the chair across from my father, the room thick with tension. "I didn't think it would come to this," she began, her voice trembling. "All this mess with the house, the papers." Her regret seemed genuine, but it was laced with defensiveness, her eyes flicking to my father as if for support. "We were trying to help Margaret," she said. "She was in trouble, Eleanor. You know how she is always struggling." The familiar excuse stung her words, echoing decades of favoritism. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "You asked me to give up my home, Mom. The one I built after Thomas died. For her debts. And you never asked, you demanded." My father shifted his jaw tight, but he stayed silent, his authority diminished in this sterile room. My mother's lips pressed thin, her hands twisting the blanket. "You've always been strong," she said, her tone almost accusatory. "Margaret isn't. She needed us, you didn't." The justification was a knife cutting deeper than I'd expected. I thought of the years I'd been the reliable one, the one who never asked for help while Margaret's failures were cushioned. "That's not love," I said, my voice shaking. "That's using me." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't back down. "Family sacrifices, Eleanor. You wouldn't understand, you've always done what you wanted." Her defensiveness flared, protecting Margaret even now, despite the public backlash, despite her own frailty. I took a breath, steadying myself. Beatrice's letter and the photograph had hinted at a deeper truth one Victor had confirmed through Thomas's note. My mother's recorded whisper, "If she finds out, we'll all go down," echoed in my mind. It was time. "You've been hiding something," I said, pulling the letter from my bag. "About my father." Her face paled, her hands freezing on the blanket. My father leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Eleanor, don't." But I ignored him. My eyes locked on her. "I found Beatrice's letter. And a photo of you, Margaret, and a man who isn't Dad. Daniel Whitaker. My real father." The room went still, the hum of the IV pump the only sound. My mother's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face, but she didn't deny it. I knew, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I knew about Daniel. He was, before Arthur, a good man, but I was young and he left. I didn't want Margaret to know she was his too, but I chose Arthur to raise you both, to keep us together. Her confession was a shock, tying Margaret to the same secret, but her next words burned. I hid it to protect her. She was fragile even then. You were always tougher. The admission was a betrayal not just of me, but of truth choosing Margaret's comfort over my identity. My father looked away, his silence a confirmation of his complicity. I slid Beatrice's letter across the bed, its pages worn but clear. Read this, I said. She warned me about you. About both of you. My mother's hands shook as she read, her eyes scanning Beatrice's words. They've hidden the truth about your father. Trust yourself as I always have. She stopped, her breath hitching, and for the first time I saw regret, not just for her illness, but for the choices that led us here. She knew, my mother murmured. She always knew we'd fail you. My father reached for her hand, but I felt no pity. Beatrice's letter exposed their generational pattern, favoring Margaret, sidelining me, hiding truths to maintain their fragile balance. I stood, my voice steady. You made your choices. Now live with them. My mother's eyes met mine, pleading, but her defense of Margaret lingered, a wall I couldn't breach. The consequences of their actions, the loss of the house, Margaret's public downfall, were theirs to bear. Beatrice had seen this day, and her letter, her cabin, her trust fund were my way forward. I turned to leave, the weight of their confession heavy but freeing. She warned me about this day, and she left me the key. The hospital room lingered in my mind as I drove away from Albany, my mother's frail confession and Beatrice's letter burning like embers. Her admission about my real father, Daniel Whitaker, and her choice to hide him for Margaret's sake had severed the last thread of obligation I felt toward my family. Beatrice's words. She warned me about this day. And she left me the key, echoed, pointing me toward the Adirondacks cabin she'd bequeathed me. My Troy home was gone, legally tied to Victor's trust, but the cabin was a fresh start, a gift from a grandmother who'd foreseen my need for escape. I packed my sparse belongings from the Albany apartment, the $50 and $1,000 trust fund from Daniel secure in my account, and headed north to Saranac Lake, ready to reclaim my life. The drive to 47 Lakeview Lane wound through pine forests, the October air crisp with the scent of damp earth. When I arrived, the cabin appeared like a painting cedar siding weathered to a soft gray. A stone chimney rising against the backdrop of a glassy lake. It was smaller than my Victorian home, with a sloped roof and a porch overlooking the water, but its simplicity felt like a balm. I stepped inside, the wood floors creaking underfoot, and found traces of Beatrice, a quilt on the couch, a shelf of poetry books, a faint lavender scent in the air. The silence was profound, broken only by the lapping of waves outside. I set my bags down, my chest loosening for the first time in months. This was no longer just a hideaway, it was home, a place where I could breathe free of my family's demands. I spent that first evening on the porch, watching the sunset paint the lake gold, feeling a peace I hadn't known since Thomas's death. The cabin was my sanctuary, a gift from Beatrice's foresight, and I vowed to make it a space of healing. Inspired by the women's communities that had rallied behind my story online, I decided to turn my experience into something bigger. I'd faced my family's pressure and emerged stronger, and I wanted to help others do the same. Using part of the $50 $1,000 trust fund, I renovated a small shed behind the cabin into a workshop space, equipping it with tables, chairs, and a whiteboard. By mid-November, I launched Breaking Free, a series of workshops for women escaping toxic family dynamics. I posted flyers in Saranac Lake's coffee shops and libraries and shared details on the same online forums that had supported me. The response was immediate. Women from nearby towns, and even as far as Syracuse, signed up, drawn by my story in the Albany Times. The first session, held on a snowy Saturday, brought 10 women to the cabin. We sat in a circle, the shed warmed by a space heater, and shared stories of overbearing parents, entitled siblings, and the guilt of saying no. I spoke of my own journey losing my home, but finding my strength, and saw nods of recognition, tears of relief. One woman, a nurse in her 40s, said, "I thought I was alone in this. You've shown me I'm not." Each workshop ended with practical steps, setting boundaries, seeking legal advice, rebuilding self-worth, and I watched these women leave, lighter, their resolve kindled. The workshops grew, and with them a community took shape. By spring, I'd hosted a dozen sessions each, drawing more attendees. Women brought friends, shared resources, and formed a network that spilled beyond the cabin. We created a private online group, Saranac Sisters, where participants posted advice, vented frustrations, and celebrated victories, like one woman who moved out of her controlling parents' home, or another who cut off a manipulative cousin. Local businesses donated coffee and pastries for our meetings, and a therapist from Plattsburgh offered free sessions for those in need. I found myself at the center of this circle, not as a leader, but as a catalyst, my own pain transformed into purpose. The cabin, once Beatrice's secret, became a beacon for women like me, its lakefront view a backdrop to our healing. I taught art history classes part-time at a nearby community college, but the workshops were my calling, a way to honor Beatrice's legacy and my own survival. Regret had no place here. Each step I took, from moving to the cabin to building this community, was a choice to live for myself, unburdened by my family's expectations. I kept my distance from Margaret and my parents, their silence a relief after the public storm. The viral fallout had cost Margaret her business ties, and I heard through a mutual friend that she'd moved to a smaller apartment, her lifestyle humbled. My parents hadn't reached out since the hospital, their consequences sealed in their own choices. I focused on my new life, planting a small garden by the cabin reminiscent of the roses I'd left behind. The community grew stronger, with women driving hours to attend their stories, echoing mine. I felt Thomas's presence in the quiet moments, his love woven into my resilience. And Beatrice's too, her foresight guiding me still. The cabin was more than a home. It was a testament to breaking free, a place where I could live without apology. One crisp morning in April, as I prepared for a workshop, a knock came at the cabin door. I opened it to find a young woman, maybe 20, with dark hair and nervous eyes, clutching a notebook. "Are you Eleanor Hayes?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I nodded, curious as she shifted her weight. "My mom said you saved her life once," she said, her words catching me off guard, a spark of connection I hadn't expected. The young woman's words, "My mom said you saved her life once," echoed as I stood on the porch of my Adirondacks cabin, the lake shimmering behind her in the April light. My workshops had built a community of women breaking free from toxic families, and this stranger's gratitude was a reminder of their impact. The cabin, Beatrice's gift, had become my sanctuary, a place of peace where I'd reclaimed my life after my family's betrayal. I'd left behind the Troy house, my co-ownership with Victor, a secret weapon, and focused on healing others. But the past wasn't done with me, and a call from Victor was about to bring it rushing back. A week after the young woman's visit, Victor reached out, his voice warm but serious over the phone. "Eleanor, I need to see you. It's about the house." I drove to Syracuse the next day, the familiar route stirring memories of our deal to outmaneuver my family. We met at the same cafe where we'd planned the sale, its cozy booths now a backdrop to a different conversation. Victor, his suit as sharp as ever, slid a folder across the table. "I owe you," he said, his eyes steady. "You gave me a chance to settle an old score with your family. I want to give the house back." The folder held a new contract offering to transfer full ownership of the Troy house to me free of charge. My co-investment of $50,000, he explained, had grown through his company's real estate deals and gratitude for my trust, and Thomas's friendship drove his offer. "It's yours," he said. "You can go home." I stared at the papers, my fingers tracing the edges. The Victorian house with its rose garden and oak staircase was where I'd rebuilt myself after Thomas's death. It held every memory of him, every moment of my resilience. But as I sat there, the lakefront cabin flashed in my mind, Its quiet porch, the community I'd built, the peace I'd found. That house was my past, a battleground of my family's greed. I'd moved on not just from their demands, but from the need to cling to those walls. Victor. I said, my voice soft but firm. I don't want it back. I've found my place. His brow furrowed, but he nodded, respecting my choice. Then what do you want to do with it? He asked. An idea sparked, born from the women who'd sat in my workshops, their stories of escape mirroring mine. I decided to donate the house as a women's shelter. The idea felt right, a way to extend Beatrice's legacy of protection and my own journey of breaking free. I worked with Victor and Patricia, my lawyer, to set up a nonprofit trust to manage the property. The Troy house, valued at $2 million, would become a haven for women fleeing toxic families, or financial ruin, offering temporary housing counseling and job training. I used part of the $50,000 trust fund from my real father, Daniel, to fund initial renovations, turning the spacious rooms into private suites, the dining area into a communal space. Victor's company handled logistics, donating resources to install security systems and update plumbing. I visited the house one last time to oversee the transition, walking through the rooms I'd once restored. The rose-patterned curtains still hung. The staircase gleamed, but it no longer felt like mine. It was a new beginning for others. The shelter, named Beatrice's Haven, opened in June, its first residents welcomed by a local charity I'd partnered with. I stood on the porch watching volunteers move in furniture and felt a quiet pride. This wasn't possession, it was purpose. The shelter's first residents included a young couple, Anna and Michael, who moved in that summer. Victor had told me their story, his voice heavy with emotion. Anna, his daughter, was 24 with bright eyes and a quiet strength. Michael, her husband, was a teacher, his calm demeanor a steadying force. They'd been victims of one of Margaret's scams, a fraudulent scholarship fund she'd pitched years ago, promising college aid, but pocketing the money. Anna had lost her chance at a degree, forced to work odd jobs to survive, while Michael supported her through the fallout. Victor's involvement in the house sale wasn't just personal, it was for Anna a way to give her a fresh start. When I met them, Anna hugged me, tears in her eyes. "Dad told me what you did," she said. "This house, it's more than a roof. It's hope." Michael nodded, his hand squeezing hers. "We'll make it our own, but we'll never forget what it means." I returned to the cabin, my workshops thriving, the Saranac Sisters community growing stronger. The shelter's opening made local news, a quiet counterpoint to the viral storm Margaret had sparked. She'd faded from the public eye, her business ties severed, her reputation in tatters. My parents hadn't reached out since the hospital, their silence a consequence I no longer carried. The house, once a symbol of my loss, was now a legacy of empowerment, a place where women like Anna could rebuild. I sat on my porch, the lake reflecting the stars, and felt Thomas's presence, his love woven into this new chapter. Beatrice's gift had led me here not to hold on to the past, but to transform it. One evening, as I prepared for a workshop, I drove to Troy to check on the shelter. The roses were blooming, the house alive with new voices. Anna and Michael greeted me at the door, their faces bright with gratitude. They'd settled in their room, filled with books and small touches of home. As I stepped inside, the weight of my family's betrayal felt distant, replaced by the warmth of what I'd created. A couple steps into the house, former victims of her sister's schemes. The sight of Anna and Michael stepping into my former Troy home, now Beatrice's Haven, filled me with a quiet warmth as I stood on its porch, the roses blooming as if in approval. Donating the house as a women's shelter had transformed it from a battleground of my family's greed into a sanctuary for others like Victor's daughter and her husband who'd been hurt by Margaret's schemes. My Adirondacks cabin had become my true home, where I led workshops for women breaking free, a community rooted in resilience. But my journey wasn't just about moving on, it was about sharing what I'd learned, closing the circle Beatrice had opened with her foresight. I wanted to leave a legacy not of vengeance, but of growth, and it began with telling my story. Back at the cabin, the lake's gentle ripples a constant companion. I started writing a memoir, a house of my own. The words poured out in the quiet evenings, my laptop glowing as I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd found Beatrice's will. I wrote of my life with Thomas, the Victorian home we'd dreamed of, and the grief that followed his death. I detailed the family dinner that sparked it all, my parents' demand to sell for Margaret's debts, their ultimatum cutting deeper than loss. I described finding Beatrice's letter and photograph, the hint of my real father, Daniel Whitaker, and the cabin that saved me. The memoir wasn't just a recounting, it was a testament to reclaiming myself, to choosing peace over resentment. I wrote of the women in my workshops, their stories mirroring mine, and how their courage fueled my own. By late summer, the manuscript was complete, 300 pages of truth woven with hope. I sent it to a small press in Syracuse recommended by a workshop attendee, and they accepted it for publication, set for release the following spring. Holding the first proof copy, its cover a soft image of a lakefront cabin. I felt a weight lift, not just my story, but a beacon for others. My thoughts turned to Lily, Margaret's daughter, who'd stood in my Albany apartment months ago, caught in her mother's storm. At 16, she was old enough to understand, yet young enough to be shaped by her mother's narrative. I wanted her to see my truth not as a weapon, but as a bridge to understanding why I'd cut contact. I inscribed the first copy of the memoir to her, Lily. This is my story and part of yours. May you find your own path. I mailed it to her Syracuse address, avoiding Margaret, hoping the book would reach her hands. I pictured her reading it in her room, her dark hair falling over the pages, learning about the grandmother she barely knew, and the aunt who'd chosen herself. I didn't expect a response. Lily was caught in a loyalty bind, but I hoped the words would plant a seed, showing her that family doesn't mean sacrifice at any cost. The memoir wasn't my only act of closure. Beatrice's original letter, the one I'd found in the Troy house's wall, felt like a sacred artifact, its elegant handwriting a link to her wisdom. It had warned of my family's betrayal, hinting at my real father, and guided me to the cabin. Now it belonged to the women of Beatrice's haven, the shelter I'd created from the Troy house. I made a copy for myself, preserving her words, and drove to Troy one crisp September morning. The shelter was thriving with 8 residents, including Anna and Michael, who greeted me warmly. I gathered them in the living room where my old furniture still stood, and handed the letter to Anna as Victor's daughter, and a symbol of the shelter's purpose. "This is from my grandmother," I said, my voice steady. "She built a legacy of protection. This house is part of it, and so are you." Anna read the letter aloud, her voice catching at Beatrice's warning. "They'll push you too far, as I feared they would." The women listened, some tearing up, seeing their own struggles in her words. I left the letter framed on the mantel, a reminder that this house was more than walls. It was a circle closed, a gift passed forward. I returned to the cabin, the lake reflecting the changing leaves, and felt a profound lightness. My family had lost the house they coveted, their plan to save Margaret's debts unraveling in public disgrace. Margaret's business had collapsed, my parents' favoritism exposed, but I harbored no glee. Vengeance had never been my goal. Freedom was. The memoir sent to Lily was my hope for her future, a chance to break the cycle I'd escaped. The letter, now with the shelter's residents, carried Beatrice's spirit to those who needed it. I sat on my porch, a mug of tea warming my hands, and thought of Thomas, whose love had anchored my strength. The workshops continued, the Saranac sisters grew, and my life was full not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd built. My family's betrayal had pushed me to this moment where I stood unburdened, my heart open to the women who called me friend, mentor, survivor. As I watched the sunset, the lake glowing with hues of amber and violet, I knew I'd found more than a place to live. The cabin, the community, the shelter. They were my home, not defined by possession, but by purpose. My family had sought to take everything, but in their loss, I'd gained everything that mattered. They lost the house. But I found my home finally. The publication of A House of My Own and the mailing of Beatrice's letter to the residents of Beatrice's Haven marked a turning point, my pain transformed into purpose. Sending the memoir to Lily was my hope for her understanding, while the Troy house, now a shelter, carried Beatrice's legacy forward. The invitation to speak at the Women Who Walked Away conference called me to share my journey, a chance to close my story with growth, not vengeance. I prepared my speech at the cabin, the lake's calm fueling my words. I distilled my lessons, choosing myself over family demands, finding strength in walking away into a message for women like those in my workshops. By October, I was ready, my journal tucked under my arm as I headed to Albany. The conference auditorium buzzed with hundreds of women, their eyes on me as I took the stage. I'm Eleanor Hayes. I began, my voice steady. I walked away from a family that demanded everything and found myself. I shared my story. Thomas's death, my parents' ultimatum to sell my home, Beatrice's cabin as my salvation. The audience leaned in, some crying, others nodding as I spoke of turning the house into a shelter. Freedom isn't revenge, I said. It's building something new. Applause erupted, a woman in the front row, standing, tears streaming, her clap sparking others. During the Q&A, a young teacher said, "Your story gave me courage to leave my toxic family." Another shared how my memoir inspired her to set boundaries. Their voices echoed the online support. I'd seen comments calling me a survivor and inspiration. I closed with a call to action. My story is yours too. Subscribe to our channel to hear more voices like these, and share your own in the comments. Let's keep this conversation alive. Backstage, I felt the weight of their response, a warmth that rivaled the lake's glow at my cabin. Beatrice's foresight, her letter, her cabin had guided me to this moment. I'd let go of anger, choosing purpose instead. Margaret's downfall and my parents' silence were their own consequences, not my victory. The shelter, my workshops, the Saranac sisters. They were my legacy, proof that walking away could lead to something greater. As I drove back to the cabin, the stars reflected on the water. I felt Thomas's love and Beatrice's wisdom. I'd become more than my pain. I'm not just Eleanor anymore. I'm the woman who walked away and kept going.